Good morning. Thank you. If you all take your seat, we'd like to get started. I am Provost Melody Graham. No, that's not my name, good Lord. Melody Blake, sorry about that. And it's my privilege to welcome you today to this solemn and sacred event. This event is being recorded and will be archived in our library. We all have a past, and most of us have things in our past that we're proud of and things that we're not so proud of. This is true for individuals, and it's also true for communities. And today we're going to talk about some of the things that we're not proud of. I personally came from a family that had secrets, and for years those secrets were not talked about. Oh, we talked about them individually, but not collectively. And that choice that we made caused us pain, it caused us suffering, and it actually caused us the inability to move forward. Then one day we gathered, and we talked together about the secrets, and it was painful. It was hard to hear, but as a result, the healing journey began. Today, Wesleyan is going to start talking collectively about what we've really only talked about to this point individually. It might be painful, it might be hard to hear, but I really do believe it's the first step in the healing process. May we all open our hearts and our minds to begin that journey together. This morning, you'll hear from Dr. Karen Huber as she presents research on our history, Dr. Tyler Schwaller as he reflects on being white, Assistant Dean Tanya Parker as she updates us on some recent events, and our president as she helps us look towards the future. But first, let's open in prayer.
God of justice and reconciling love, prepare our hearts and our minds. Where we see that we have fallen short, guide us to turn around, to do things differently. Where we have set high ideals, help us to live into them, that this might not just be a diverse place, but a place where all are included, where all can flourish. Help us, O God, to reject evil and injustice in all of the ways that they present themselves, especially to reject and to undo the evils and injustices of racism and white supremacy. Prepare our hearts and our minds, O God, that we might be ready to do the work of bearing your justice and reconciling love in the world. Amen.
Good morning. My name is Karen Huber, and I'm Associate Professor of History at Wesleyan, and I've had the privilege over the last couple of years to start looking into some of the ugly details of our past. And so, if I come back down here and grab my notes, this will work better. Those of you who know me from the classroom know I like to walk around anyway. So, we're going to talk a little bit today about what we know so far. And the so far is really important in here because this is an ongoing process. And we actually are still working on this. We started this process a couple of years ago in 2015. And we will continue it throughout this year and probably into future years. We plan to interview alumni, faculty, staff, people who have worked in the community near Wesleyan, and try to find answers to some of the questions that are painful to ask but important. So a couple of notes before we get going. First of all, this is an ongoing project. We're not done. So there are some things that we're not going to talk about, not because we don't care about them, but because we don't know the answers yet. If you have a question you think we ought to be asking that isn't addressed, please, by all means, contact either me or Dr. Stenek, and let us know. We may have already thought of it, but we might not have. The other note is on historical sources and methods. Our standards of evidence in history vary by time period. And for some of the time periods we're looking at, we have very little evidence about anything other than the elite. And so we are trying to read against the grain to understand sources of produced by elites, for elites, about elites, in order to find some clues about non-elite people in those sources. All right, let's get into the fun. History's fun. Okay. So, from its founding in 1836 as Georgia Female College, Wesleyan College benefited from the systematic racism and the system of enslavement of people of African origin that permeated the United States and especially the South from its origins until, one could argue, today. So enslavement ended, but we still see racism as a systematic part of the United States. Wesleyan, whether intentionally or not, has benefited throughout this period because of white privilege, because of its position. What you're looking at up here is hard to see, but I think you can all agree that there's a lot of orange. And so let me do a little bit of explanation about what this is. And I'm going to read to you for a minute, but then I'll come back to wandering around. So as you look at this, what we're looking at is an analysis that our wonderful student Christina did for us this summer of the Board of Trustees from the founding in 1839 through 1875. 1875 isn't an important year, it's just where we stopped. And what you're seeing there is a list of people who cross-referenced on the 1840, 1850, or 1860 slave schedules, which are lists of people who owned slaves. And so from our Board of Trustees, the orange are people who owned slaves either in 1850 or 1860. The, what color is it? Sort of gray are the people who did not own slaves, and the yellow are ones we couldn't find, we couldn't figure out. So if you look at that, just take a good look at this and tell me what you see. Shout it out, someone yell. Lots of orange, okay? And this right here, oh, do I have a pointer? I have a pointer. Okay, so those of you who know me from class know laser pointers make me happy. So we see, oh, so I'm going to yell, okay? Can you hear me in the back? I hate mics. I like yelling. Okay, so if you see emancipation, where's emancipation on this? Along here. Okay, so here's emancipation. So no one owned slaves after this. But why am I looking at this here? What is the significance of looking at this here? It was after the Civil War. Okay, it's after the Civil War. Emancipation has happened. There are no more slaves. Why do I care who owned slaves before the Civil War if they're on the Board of Trustees after the Civil War? It shows a continuation, right? A continuation of thought. When the war ended, people didn't automatically change their minds. They didn't automatically change their thoughts. And so what we see here is we have got lots and lots and lots of trustees. As far as we looked, 1875, it probably didn't end. That's just where we stopped looking. Of people who did own slaves during the antebellum period. Okay. You know I love graphs, but we'll move on. All right. So, the first 6 presidents of the college were all slaveholders. The men who gave money to found the college and served on the early Board of Trustees, as we just saw, were for the most part slave owners. As we look through the history of Wesleyan, we see that it is likely that the funds that built, maintained, and continued the college, at least during its first 3 decades, but as we saw from the graph, well past that, were probably funds that were the fruit of enslaved labor. We can say that slavery probably built Wesleyan. The end of slavery, as I said, continues this. We see the continuing presence of former slaveholders on the board, and we continue to see sort of an idea of white supremacy continuing, as it did throughout the United States,
at Wesleyan for many decades to come. So the first president, this guy, the Reverend George Foster Pierce, was himself a slaveholder. His biographer and friend, George Smith, recalled that, quote, while he was in the college, he had bought a slave, Jenny, his cook, who had remained with him until she had grown grandchildren of her own. This enslaved woman and her children were presumably among the 4 enslaved people that we find in the 1840 census slave schedule, who were living along with 129 white people at Wesleyan's campus. So they categorized the president as the head of the entire campus household. And so you can see here, next one, the census, and this image is George Foster Pierce and his household of 125 young ladies in that age group, sorry. So we've got 125 young ladies there. And then if we turn the page, which I didn't do the first couple times I looked at this, so I thought he didn't have any slaves. When you turn the page, you find the continuation. And here you've got this line, which is the continuation of Pierce's entry. And up here we have 1 male enslaved person under 10 years old, 2 between 10 and 24, and only 1 woman over here between 24 and 36, who is presumably Jenny. We know a name. And that's something for the antebellum period. We know a name. So enslaved people like Jenny and her children likely carried out much of the heavy labor on campus. Records from this period are very scanty. We don't know much, and people didn't write much down about their slaves. But we do know that the college administrators and faculty purchased additional labor from other local slaveholders by hiring out, this was the term they used, enslaved people to work for the college. In exchange for their labor, they received clothing and food, and their owner received their wages. We have specific evidence of this from 1861. On October 21st, the faculty's minutes record an agreement made between the college's porter and the faculty about hiring an enslaved man named William. Another name. The only 2 we have we have 3 from the entire antebellum period. The faculty and the college porter each gave $50 to the cost of hiring William, which was $100 total. The $100 went to Reverend J.M. Bunnell, a churchman and the college's president. This is the entry from the slave schedule showing J.M. Bunnell. We don't know much about William other than that his tasks included assisting the porter, ringing the college bells, tending the fires and the recitation in classrooms, going to the post office, hauling water, and answering the front doorbell, as well as running errands for the faculty. But we can learn a little bit more from the slave schedule if we guess that the enslaved person Bunnell is hiring out in 1861 is one of the people listed on the slave schedule. So, who can tell what I can tell? This is a learning experience. Can you read any of this? Okay, so take a look up here. John and Bunnell, I know 19th century writing is hard. Over here it says number of slaves, and they're listing each slave individually, but they don't list the slaves' names. How do we know that William is either 32 or 40 years old? Okay, we only have 2 listed as male. So the other 4 are all listed as female. So this is what we know. This is the kind of guesswork and the kind of detective work we have to do as we work through a project like this to study a non-elite group of people whose existence was actually not recorded carefully, except in this case to get the 3/5 vote, or for tax records. So this is a real detective process here. So we know that William is probably 32 or 40 years old. Guess what they called him in the faculty minutes? The boy William. And this is one of the many derogatory terms that we find throughout the records in the college's history about people of color that are used to reinforce this idea of a sub-status. Okay. I'll let you look at this while I talk. This image, I'll just tell you, is from 1936, but they're talking about, so the racist imagery here is from 1936, but they're actually talking about 1861. All right, so in addition to Jenny and William, we actually know one other name. We know the name Nellie, and Nellie was also a slave, a woman who was brought by her mistress to college with her. And so her mistress, whose name I'm not going to tell you, although it's in our official history, I'll give Nellie her name and withhold the mistress. Her mistress gave an interview in 1925 where she claimed to have been the first student to bring an enslaved person to campus with her to act as her maid. Another student claimed to have done it a couple of years later. And so here we have from 1936, when they probably should have known better, this drawing showing a really racialized image, cartoon, of Nellie the maid showing up at Wesleyan. During the Civil War, we know that Wesleyan was definitely pro-Confederacy. The president, the faculty, and the students supported the Confederate cause. The college remained open throughout the war and offered free tuition to the daughters of Confederate officers who were killed. And in fact, the president had two regiments formed, the Bonnell Blues and the Freeman Guard, and the students dressed up in paper hats and carried carved wooden guns and pretended they were soldiers. And so here again from that 1936 source, we have a cartoon showing the young ladies dressed up in their uniforms. So we've got them up here and over here and over here. All of this is to tell us something that's not really shocking to us. Wesleyan was part of the Deep South. We were part of an ingrained racist system, and that we exploited cheap, or in some cases here, free enslaved labor. But let's talk about what happens after emancipation. We know that African American labor kept Wesleyan running since its founding. And although we don't have specific evidence that enslaved laborers built the physical buildings of the old Wesleyan College downtown, what we know about the region's economy makes it really likely that they did. We know from wage ledgers that after emancipation, Wesleyan did employ African Americans throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries as porters, maids, cooks, and laundresses. We know that they were able to pay low wages because of systematic racism that allowed African Americans to be paid much less than white workers. We know that the discrimination meant that students freely mocked African American employees, and we see this throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s in the school yearbooks. Checking on my time here. All right. This is one of the many employees we don't know much about. We have a painting done in 1893. I think in 1893, I can't read behind me, but we have a painting done around 1893 by a Wesleyan senior of this woman who they called Aunt Cindy. Aunt and uncle were used not as symbols of respect, but as a symbol of the lower status that African American employees had at the school. They wouldn't be called Mr. or Mrs. They would have their first names used. Aunt Cindy we know about from two sources, this painting and also the minutes from the Board of Trustees where they didn't even know her name. Can you read this up here? No, okay. I can't read it either from this angle, but it essentially says that the servant, Cindy, they filled in her name later because they couldn't remember it when they were writing the minutes, would be given room and board at the college if she agreed to stop selling stuff to the students. This is presumably someone who had spent her life working for the college and now had nothing to support her in her old age. We don't know that for sure. We're still working on evidence, but this is just one of those many mysteries we're working on. There are lots of other faces in yearbooks that we don't have names for yet. There are only a few that we've identified, but we're working on trying to find these stories of African American employees. Beginning in 1908, we start to see a new daily overt racism and white supremacist outlet in the form of a really troubling class name. After the Civil War, a group of former Confederate officers formed the Ku Klux Klan. In its early form, it terrorized African Americans, Yankees, Republicans, other people it disagreed with across the Reconstruction South. But by the time we get to 1908, it had largely disbanded. We see one mention in the newspaper the year before 1908 about an action in Alabama, but the Klan was largely defunct at that point. However, in 1905, Thomas Dixon Jr. published The Klansman, a historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan. It would later become the film Birth of a Nation. But before it was a film, he produced his trio of novels as plays, and they played in Macon. We know that the Klansman played in 1905, the 1909 class's freshman year, importantly, at the Grand Opera House. We know that its sequel, The Traitor, also played in Macon at the Grand Opera House in 1908. And we know that it was a massive production, including 75 people on stage, masses of special effects, and even horses. It is likely from newspaper reports that the students attended these plays, and it is certainly clear that they were inspired by them. Because the class of 1909, who were freshmen when the Klansmen came to town, decided to name their class the Ku Klux Klan. The classes of 1913, 1917, and 1921 all used the Klan name or the Ku Klux class name. Later on, and a lot of us have heard this story, Wesleyan lore indicated that the words Ku Klux, which were later emblazoned on the 1913 yearbook, there we go, the 1913 yearbook really referred to a circle of friends. We have found absolutely no evidence to support that assertion. It is very clear that the class of 1909, the class of 1913, the class of 1917 all knew what Ku Klux Klan meant and meant that name to apply to themselves. When we look at the imagery they used, it's very clear. Here from the 1913 yearbook, the title page, we have a knight rider. Going forward, we see the history of their class, and they talk about becoming the Ku Klux Klan. Here we have images from the 1910 yearbook of a female figure holding a burning cross with freshmen 1913, so they're the freshman class who will be the graduates of 1913. And we have the cover of their yearbook, which they called the Ku Klux. This is really unambiguous. These are all ways that they are continuing what was a rising tide at the time of glorification of the Old South, something which, before this weekend, I think I might have said was in the past, but we've seen it's not. In 1920, after more than a decade of classes using the name Ku Klux Klan, we do see a change to the tri-Ks, but a lot of the imagery stays the same, and even in 1919 and 1920, they continue to occasionally use Ku Klux Klan in its whole. We start to see tri-K going through the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. And no one changed it. In the 1990s, we do finally see a change come, and we can thank those members of the class of 1993 for initiating that change. Throughout, the name isn't the only problem, though, that we see. Throughout the entire history of the 20th century at Wesleyan, we see yearbook photos and other student-produced work that continues to mock African Americans. We see students who are dressed in blackface. We see racist caricatures of jazz bands. And I'm going to stop reading and just show you some of these for now and try to tell you what year they're from.
All right, so this is from the 1919 yearbook, and you can see that the pirate symbol is wearing a tri-K necklace, like pearls. This is when a very famous and apparently much beloved employee who was called Uncle Johnson, his real name was Thornton Johnson. It took us 2 years to find his first name because no one used it. When we finally found him, when he died, they have this supposed tribute to him where they continue to mock his speech patterns. So how are you this morning, Uncle Johnson? And the answer, my health am in a state of discation most compound proficient. And it continues. And this use of dialect, this use of sort of this over-the-top racialized dialect is very, very frequent in many of the yearbooks we see throughout the 20s and 30s especially. This is from 1932, where this is just an image, a throwaway image that they decided to use to mark the dividing page between the yearbook and the advertisements at the end of the yearbook. And it's small, it's hard to see in the back, but we have a very racialized drawing of an African American jazz band. This is from 1947, and this is the advertisement for a minstrel show, the cover of a program for the minstrel show that was held in the Wesleyan gym. This is probably the worst, well, other than the Ku Klux Klan. Here we have from 1945, students decided to glorify in their yearbook the Old South. And to do that, they dressed up in antebellum clothing and decided it was a really good idea to get African American staff to pose with them in servile positions to act like slaves. So this is 1945. It looks like something out of the antebellum period, but this is 1945. This is also 1945. And this was fine. This is what they thought was fine. Are you angry? I am. This is from the 1950s. This is from Stunt. What do you see? Yeah. So we see blackface. We see it over and over again. We had too many things to choose from. I only have a few images to show you of it, but we have lots of blackface through here. Through the 50s, we see it even past the 50s. And we have rats, and this is a whole other kettle of fish to talk about, but we have lots of racialized images in the initiation practices that we see going back all the way to 1908. We see this process of having some sort of initiation, even though we can't trace the exact practices because they were secret. But in the 1950s, they start giving us pictures of rats' initiations. And what do you see? Yeah, nooses. Okay, we start to see nooses. We start to see people in whiteface, and some of it is clearly racialized. Some of it is up to interpretation, but that interpretation is important, and people, if they're scared, are still in a hostile environment. So let's talk about something more positive. We start to see some change in the 1960s. And we have heard, most of us, a lot about the first five, but actually there are two students we need to talk about before the first five, but the stories aren't as happy. So in 1965, we see a student, and I've covered up their addresses, which were published. I'm sure they're not there anymore, but we see these two students who were admitted, one in 1965 and one in 1966. The student who was admitted in 1965 decided not to attend. We're not certain why. The student who was admitted in 1966 did attend. She came for a semester, and I just had the privilege of interviewing someone who knew her last week, and she had a rough time. She participated enthusiastically in RATS. She tried to fit in. She actually won an award as one of the most enthusiastic participants in RATS weekend. But by the end of her fall semester, she left the college and moved to Washington, D.C., and her friend who I spoke to said this was because she was getting death threats. I think we need to think about that. In 1968, we see the entrance of the first 5 African American students who would graduate from Wesleyan. And we start to see some change, but very slowly. And the African American students who come to Wesleyan in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, all continue to face that tri-K name. They all continue to face some serious, ingrained problems. Here's just one example. Fall of 1968, the first 5 have arrived as freshmen on campus, and this is what is in their October 3rd campus newspaper. Welcome, freshmen, with love from the sophomores, and a big noose hanging from a tree. Is this thoughtlessness or intentional racism? Hard to say. We know that RATS was problematic, and we have evidence of that throughout this period. I'm running out of time. In fact, I'm way past time. So I'm just going to tell you that we have lots of images that you can come and look at. They are troubling. Images of nooses, images of hoods that mean different things to different people. A lot of people have told me that when they were participating in this, it never occurred to them how racist it might seem. But I think we need to think about these symbols and what they mean for us. So in 1992, we see a change. And I'll come back and finish up quickly.
In 1992 and 1993, we start to see the class of 93 deciding to end the Tri-K name. And as we see this happening, there are still a lot of people who argue it's tradition, we need to keep it because it's tradition. Even as we move into the 2000s and we move from rats to lynx, some of those symbols that were terrifying, some of that waking up in the middle of the night continues. And as late as 2013, we see moments where students are still being terrified, when students are still facing what they see as racialized symbols in our initiation processes. Even in studying the past, we've fallen short. This is not the first project to look at Wesleyan's history. This is not the first project to try to understand the origins of the Tri-K class name or the racist imagery of some of Wesleyan's traditions. Alumni stretching back to the 1990s have contacted me since this project began to share stories of research projects that were not taken seriously or of running up against institutional resistance to change. As recently as this decade, students and faculty were discouraged from calling out the racist nature of some of Wesleyan's traditions, including research into the origins of the class name. I don't have permission from many of those people to use their names, but I do have permission from Dr. Doherty to talk about the fact that in 2009, she tried to do a research project and was told to stop spreading disinformation. Our institution and our community are still trying to come to terms with, understand, and most importantly, document our recent past. To this end, the Wesleyan Oral History Project is soliciting interviews from alumni, staff, faculty, community members, anyone with a story to share with us. We want to better understand this history. We can't come to terms with it until we know what happened. We want to know it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I'll stop talking because I'm over time. Thank you.
In an earlier version of my remarks, I was planning to ask you all to pause and take a deep breath because this is hard stuff. Now, you can breathe if you want. You should breathe. But I'm not going to tell you how to breathe because it occurred to me that too often people in positions like mine tell others to take deep breaths, not actually so that they will feel better, but to diffuse legitimate tensions, to make ourselves feel better, more comfortable. If you are angry or hurt or anxious because of this history or because the present just isn't good enough, I'm not going to tell you simply to take a breath and to calm down. Take stock of how you feel, own how you feel, breathe however you want, however you need to breathe, and feel however you want, however you need to feel. I feel white, and I feel responsible. Not because I chose to be white, not because I have committed the kinds of heinous acts that self-avowed white supremacists have, but because white supremacy is a white problem. And as long as there are white people calling for the consolidation of white power and for the extermination of people of color, we who are white have to stand up. It is not enough simply to say that we ourselves are not racist. It is not enough simply to be nice and to believe the right things. We have to lead the way in rejecting and undoing white supremacy. For too long, many of us who are white and who care about the problems of racism have said to people of color, teach us, help us be better, as if their workload is not enough in dealing with all manner of micro and macroaggressions on top of just living life. We who are white don't need to be taught. We need to learn actively, intentionally. And that begins by considering what it even means to be white. What does it mean? I'm embarrassed to say that I haven't given much consideration to my own whiteness until far too recently. Why is that? Maybe it's because so much of what we think and believe and assume in this country is filtered through the presumption of whiteness as the ultimate good, of white people as ultimately good. We think Jesus was white and he was born in the Middle East. What is up with that? We think Santa Claus is white and he's not even real. I'm sorry to break it to you. Now, I do want to be clear, I'm not saying that white folks should feel bad about being white. I'm saying, as I have learned from wiser, bolder people before me, that we need to reflect critically on what whiteness means. We should think about the rich nuances and complexities of human existence that we miss when we assume whiteness as the norm and then count everyone else as diverse. We should think about the harm that we do to our very own selves, to our own moral formation, when we don't take our histories seriously enough, when we let ourselves become defensive without ever developing a thorough sense of moral responsibility to care for one another, for every one another. When I heard the chant from Charlottesville, "You will not replace us," I was bewildered. The sentiment is obviously incredibly hurtful and offensive, but it's also incredibly stupid. Who is saying that they're trying to replace anyone? How fragile can the white supremacist ego be to defend against a threat that no one else has actually made? It strikes me as supremely immature. And that's why we need to think about our whiteness. It's a matter of growing up, of taking responsibility for the ways that we act in the world, for the ways that we learn from and relate to one another. Most of us here who are white, I hope this is true of all of us, would never engage in such violence and outright bigotry. But what about the times that we too can become defensive when we hear others name the ways that they have been hurt? White privilege? Me? But I have hardships too. Yes, it is undoubtedly true that people who are white have struggles, and we can own that, we can talk about that. We should talk about the unjust systems that keep so many people down. I'm not going to tell you to take a deep breath and to calm down, but if we get defensive when our black and brown kin proclaim that their lives matter in the face of constant threats and violence, then we have some work to do on ourselves. So let's take our histories seriously in all of their complexities. Let's reckon with the ways that uninterrogated whiteness has reigned supreme, and that too often has been a reign of terror. And let's not do this because we can fix the past, but because we can make the present and the future more equitable, more just. Let's come to a place where whiteness is not the presumed default for humanity, and then there are diverse others, but where it's understood that we become human through our interactions with each other, through the ways that we impact and are impacted by the lives of others. Let's make our impact positive and strive urgently to be better when we learn that what we're doing causes harm. We need to take that seriously and do better. And for today and tomorrow and for as long as it takes until it's true, let's keep saying that Black lives matter and let's live like it.
Good morning. Reverend Schwaller just spoke to you about whiteness, and perhaps you may think that I am going to speak to you about blackness, as I do know a thing or two about it, as it comes with my presence, without exception. Everything I say will be heard as black because it comes forth from my mouth. So instead of dwelling on how my message will be received, I will just deliver it. I organized a campus meeting on June 30th and simply entitled it, Let's Talk. The purpose of that gathering was to bring the campus community together to assess the present and discuss possibilities in moving forward. There were 46 participants, including 21 staff, 12 faculty, 9 current students, and 4 alumni. I shared a segment of the speech Frederick Douglass delivered in 1857 as he addressed the efforts of Great Britain and the West Indians who had been enslaved as they struggled towards new liberty and emancipation. He said, "Let me give you a word on the philosophy of reform. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. The conflict has been exciting, agitating, all-absorbing, and for the time being, putting all other tumults to silence. It must do this or it does nothing. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, and it may be both a moral and a physical one, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. I stated that these words by Douglass were true then, and they are true now, as we are in an emotional, tumultuous time at Wesleyan College. I stress this is not only a time of reconciliation, but one of transformation, one of reformation, and we must realize, as Frederick Douglass stated, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. The information I shared was followed by Dean of Faculty, Dr. Matt Martin, who gave an overview of the incidents leading up to the publication of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution article, which was released a few days prior. Most of the community members had read the article, but many of them were not aware of the research Dr. Karen Huber had already gathered since the commission of 2015. Participants were then divided into 4 groups, and they worked together to identify present challenges and explore possibilities for moving forward. The compilation of the information gathered is as follows. Present challenges: communication barriers and lack of transparency, distribution of information, what has been done, what's going on now. People on campus don't know each other, including students, faculty, staff. Lack of diversity in faculty and staff. Lack of trust between students and the administration. Addressing the class names, Tri-K, Knights. Negative responses on Facebook from alumni and current students. Concern about how the negative publicity will affect enrollment. How will we deal with the grief and the hurt of the alumni? People don't understand the progress, don't know that it will take time. Too many narratives, some personal, some not. Addressing the ongoing problems directly. And here are the possibilities, ideas for moving forward. Having conversations like these for all campus members to participate. Workshops and trainings to discuss trends and correct language. Change the class names and include alumni in the name changes. Keep students in the front of everything that we do. Include the history and the past and the current events and efforts that are going on in new student orientation. Tell our diversity story as it is happening. Continue to create solutions with students, faculty, staff together like this. In my closing remarks, I stated, as you can see, there is much to be done, but things are happening. The challenges we face did not evolve overnight, nor will the solutions. Several approaches must be taken. Some will succeed, some will fail, but we cannot let fear of failure stop us from trying. As we say in the vernacular, the struggle is real, while echoing in our minds, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. We are in a struggle, but we are also progressing. The success of our progress depends on all of us, shared responsibility in moving Wesleyan forward. Wesleyan has a past that has not been welcoming or inclusive of people who look like me. Yet, I did graduate from here in 2001, and I stand before you today as the Assistant Dean of Students for Diversity and Inclusion. And as you look around this auditorium, you see visible diversity is present. You can hear it in languages and dialects spoken among various other characteristics that can be captured by sight and sound. So yes, we are overcoming, but we have not overcome. The diversity is great, but inclusion is better. True inclusion, aligned with equity and empathy in action, is much better. A diverse group of people gathered together does not equate communication and relationships. Are you personally, actively, intentionally working to include and engage with others who may be in the visible and in the invisible margins of our campus? Each individual must contribute in this work to achieve true inclusion, lest we will not get there. It's only through expressing the truth of our experience and fully listening to each other that we turn diversity and inclusion into a practice instead of a buzzword. Instead of talking at students, in 2016, Dr. Melanie Doherty and I created student-run groups driven by student concerns about diversity and inclusion issues across campus. DID, as it is called, empowers students to fully hear one another and speak their truth back to the college community. Through the communication skills that are gathered in these DID groups, students become equipped to use their voices together to ask for the changes they most want to see. As we move further into this new school year of transition for Wesleyan College, know that we are listening. Your staff, your faculty, your administration are listening to you, and we encourage you to listen to each other as well. This convocation will end soon. The discussion does not. We will continue with it today. Meet us after this convocation ends in Trice to continue the conversation. What you witnessed today is not just in the past, it's fully present. Just take a look at the state of our nation right now. Racism continues to be the deepest wound in American culture. If you are asleep on that, wake up. If you are woke, stay woke. We must address these issues head on. Then, and only then, can we create new ways of healing together inclusively. Thank you.
This summer, we issued a public apology for what you have just seen and heard from Dr. Huber, and I'd like to read that apology to you. Wesleyan College's history includes parts that are deeply troubling, and we are not proud of them. When Wesleyan was founded in 1836, the economy of the South was based on the sin of slavery. We are sorry for the pain that parts of our past have caused and continue to cause. We also celebrate how far our college has come and how we are striving to become the inclusive community we are called to be. Wesleyan College can be a community where all kinds of people are able to know, trust, learn from, and care for one another. Our story is one of hope, where the lessons of history make us stronger. Like many of you, I am a product of the South, and I have spent my life, even since childhood, confronting the effect of white privilege on me, committing my life and my work to equality and social justice. My modus operandus has been to walk the talk as a parent, a community member, a minister, and a teacher. And that's why when I first learned about the images associated with the Tri-K Pirates, I hoped my efforts to create programs and curricula to promote equity and selection of faculty, staff, and campus speakers, and to treat all students with respect would be enough. It has not been enough. I have not done enough. We have not done enough. We have not been honest with students and each other, even about the distant past, and we have not been vigilant to ensure that there are no traces of the past in the present. We must examine our language, our images, our traditions, our policies, our practices, and especially our behavior, and remove from them anything that is offensive and divisive. This includes class names and traditions, the very things that replaced sororities in the early 1900s to create community spirit and to define sisterhood have become more divisive than inclusive. I pledge today to work with you, with each of you, to change the things that divide us as we move toward a more just and equitable future. I learned this summer that even in recent years, some of the meanness that upper-class students have enjoyed inflicting on first-year students to initiate them into sisterhood has had racial undertones and has poisoned the nurturing community that we claim to be. This must change, or it will destroy our college. And when those traditions change, we must ask ourselves, how will we create community going forward? How will we do this? We will not please everyone because we come from such different perspectives, but I pray that what we do will be the best for the college, for its present and its future. Today, we begin a process of healing and transformation, reconciling our past with our future, and reconciling with one another. This will take a full year just to get started, and we will need assistance from lots of experts and from lots of you. Thankfully, we have identified some who are very excited about working with us because of who we are and because of who we want to be. And thankfully, some of those experts are right in our midst. Faculty and staff, alumni. And some activities have already been planned to begin this work this fall, and you will see those activities listed on the back of your program. This week, we created a President's Council for Diversity and Inclusion comprised of students, faculty, staff, alumni, and trustees. And beginning immediately, a task force led by Dr. Karen Bray will guide a process of truth, racial healing, and transformation, working our way through 4 phases that have been outlined by the Kellogg Foundation. Phase 1 is assessment, and we're starting right now. In fact, as Dr. Huber said, she started a couple of years ago, and we'll assess through the end of September. Phase 2 is truth and truth-telling, and that will take us much of the fall. Phase 3 is narrative change. How do we change the way we talk about all of these things? That will take us through the early spring. And we'll finish the year with a period of transformation. Let me end by saying that in my years in South Carolina until I moved to Georgia, I was involved in many conversations, marches, protests, and votes to remove the Confederate flag from atop the State House. It didn't matter if the flag meant history or heritage to some. It was an insult and symbol of hatred to many, and it needed to come down. Eventually, in 2000, the flag came down, and the legislature that removed it from the dome proclaimed that it had found a suitable place for this symbol in front of the Confederate monument on the State House grounds. But that monument and the flag that flew in front of it was front and center at the intersection where Main Street ran into Gervais. It remained there until 2 years ago. And do you know what it took for the flag to come down? The deaths of 9 innocent worshipers at Emmanuel African American Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, at the hands of a white supremacist on June 17, 2015. When South Carolina leaders still hadn't acted 10 days later, a young woman, Bree Newsom, climbed up that flagpole and took the flag down by herself. For that act, she was arrested. And finally, a few days later, the governor signed a bill to remove the flag forever. Must we wait for more violence to occur before we act? Are not Charleston, Charlottesville, St. Louis, Oklahoma City, and nearly every corner of the United States enough for us to shout, "No more"? And what about Wesleyan College? Can we hope to become a truly inclusive community? I'm proud of the work that we are doing at Wesleyan, but the real work is just starting, and we are not alone. We are working alongside many other colleges and universities whose own histories of slavery and racism appear daily in the news. But one thing is certain. At Wesleyan, we're not just telling our stories. We're not just talking about diversity. We are struggling toward inclusion, and we need your help. Will you join us in the struggle? Can we join hands and minds and hearts to find a better way, to find a way forward to a more just future for us all? Will you join us in prayer for healing and for the ongoing work of transformation? Let us pray. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. Help us, dear God of all people, to be your voice of peace and your arms and feet of justice. Give us hope for the future and prepare us for the storms that are inevitable when we disagree with each other and with those who do not seek peace. May we work together to establish in this place, Wesleyan College, a shelter of inclusive love, that we may be a beacon of peace. Shalom, An, Salam, Santi, Pas, Pei, Mir, Gangwa, Heiwa. Amen.